Linda barely had time to process what she had just heard. David Carter. The name alone sent a cold shock through her spine. The man wasn't just wealthy. He was power personified. A tech mogul, a business strategist, a billionaire who could make or break corporations with a single decision. And she had just spent the last hour humiliating his son. Oh. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned back toward first class, her mind racing through every interaction she had had with Jamal, the dismissive tone, the forced politeness, the unnecessary skepticism. Her stomach twisted. She had treated him like an outsider, and now, with all eyes on her, she realized she was the one who didn't belong. Then a deep, measured voice cut through the tension like a blade. Here you are, kid. How's the flight?" Silence rippled through the cabin. Heads turned, whispers spread like wildfire. David Carter himself had entered the first-class cabin. Tall, composed, and radiating effortless authority, he strode toward his son, his presence alone shifting the atmosphere. Even the most important businessmen aboard, the ones who commanded boardrooms and controlled billion-dollar deals, stiffened in their seats. Jamal didn't say a word, he simply met his father's gaze, his composure unwavering. David Carter's sharp brown eyes swept across the cabin before landing directly on Linda. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. And in that moment, Linda knew. Her career, her reputation, her entire professional world was hanging by a thread. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain, to salvage what little dignity she had left. But before she could speak, Carter did something far worse than scolding her. He ignored her entirely. Instead, he turned back to Jamal, resting a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "Let's go," he said simply. And just like that, they walked off the plane heads high, leaving Linda standing there, exposed, humiliated, and utterly powerless. The passengers exchanged glances. Some shook their heads, others smirked knowingly. Mrs. Bennet took a slow sip of wine, watching Linda with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just witnessed karma do its job. Linda swallowed hard. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the one in control. She was the one being judged. What would you have done in this situation? But before we go deeper into this story, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next one. The first-class cabin exuded quiet luxury, a world apart from the hustle of the airport just beyond the boarding gates. Plush leather seats, each wide enough to stretch out comfortably, gleamed under the soft glow of the overhead lighting. The air smelled of expensive cologne, freshly brewed espresso, and the faintest hint of warm vanilla from the scented towelettes provided before takeoff. Everything was designed for exclusivity, from the sleek marble countertops at the in-flight bar to the perfectly aligned glasses of champagne resting on polished tray tables. The passengers who occupied these seats were a reflection of this world, each belonging to a rarefied class of wealth and influence. Conversations were hushed but purposeful, murmured between sips of imported wine and the occasional glance at the latest stock updates on gleaming tablets. A well-dressed CEO in his mid-50s, salt and pepper hair impeccably styled, scrolled through emails with a sharp intensity, his manicured fingers tapping briskly against his phone screen. Across the aisle, a woman in a navy blue designer suit flipped through the latest edition of Forbes, her eyes scanning an article on rising global markets while she idly twisted the diamond ring on her left hand. Further down the row, an older gentleman with silver-framed glasses adjusted his reading light, opening a leather-bound notebook filled with precise, handwritten notes. Perhaps the final touches on a billion-dollar deal. A businessman, sleeves rolled up, fingers moving swiftly across his laptop keyboard, typed furiously as if every second wasted meant money lost. The flight attendants moved with effortless precision, their smiles practiced and professional, their uniforms crisp and unwrinkled despite the long hours. They catered to their elite clientele with a subtle deference, refilling glasses before they were empty, anticipating needs before requests were made. One poured a delicate stream of sparkling water into a crystal glass, nodding as the passenger barely acknowledged the gesture. Another discreetly adjusted a blanket for an elderly woman who had already drifted into sleep, the pearls around her neck catching the dim cabin light with each gentle rise and fall of her chest. This was not merely a flight, it was an unspoken social order, a silent hierarchy where every passenger carried an invisible currency beyond money. Power, connections, influence. The expectation was clear. Everyone in this space belonged. They had earned their place, not just through wealth, but through legacy, through status, through the quiet, unshakable assurance that they were meant to be here. It was an ecosystem where familiarity bred comfort, and where a single unfamiliar presence could disrupt the carefully maintained balance. As the last few passengers settled in, conversations resumed, flight attendants performed their final checks, and the soft chime of the intercom signaled that the aircraft would soon depart for Los Angeles. Another routine flight, another seamless journey for the privileged few. Or so it seemed. No one yet realized that within minutes, an unspoken rule of this exclusive world would be tested in a way none of them expected. Jamal Carter stepped onto the plane, his movements smooth and deliberate, his posture upright but relaxed. At 16, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that didn't demand attention, but naturally commanded it. His hoodie was clean, the fabric soft and well-fitted rather than oversized. His jeans were dark and crisp, not sagging, not ripped, just neat. His sneakers weren't designer, but they were spotless, laced up perfectly. He moved with the kind of ease that came from knowing exactly who he was, but in a space like this, where luxury was an expectation, not a privilege, it was also the kind of ease that drew scrutiny. The moment he reached the boarding checkpoint for first class, Linda Parker's practiced smile faltered, just slightly, but enough for the keen observer to notice. In her 20 years as a flight attendant, she had developed an instinct for who belonged in these seats, and in her mind, Jamal Carter did not. He was too young, too casual, and, though she would never say it aloud, too black. Her fingers hovered over the scanner as she stared at the ticket in his outstretched hand. Jamal held it steady, patient, unmoving. He was used to this moment, the second of hesitation that always seemed to come when someone had to process the fact that he was in a space they hadn't expected him to be in. He knew how it went, the slight narrowing of the eyes, the way their brain worked through a list of justifications for why they were skeptical. Linda was doing exactly that now, her lips pressing together as if she were debating whether to question him. Her nails, painted a neutral shade of pink, tapped lightly against the scanner before she finally took the ticket from his hand. She looked at the seat number, then back at him. Flying first class today?" The tone was light, almost polite, but there was an edge to it, a thin layer of doubt wrapped in forced professionalism. Jamal nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yes, ma'am." Linda hummed, her eyes flicking to the boarding screen as if double-checking for an error. Then, with deliberate slowness, she scanned his ticket. The green light blinked. The seat was real. Still, her hesitation didn't leave. For a moment too long, she just stood there, holding the ticket between her fingers as if it might change under further examination. When she finally handed it back, her smile was tight, forced. "All right," she said, stepping aside. "Enjoy your flight." But as he passed, she added, in a tone just low enough to not sound like a direct challenge, but pointed enough to carry weight. "Just make sure you don't wander into first class by mistake." Jamal didn't flinch, but his grip on his backpack strap tightened just slightly. He met her gaze for half a second longer than necessary, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement. He had heard her. He understood exactly what she meant. Then, without a word, he walked past her, shoulders squared, head held high. A few feet away, a businessman in a tailored charcoal suit glanced up from his tablet, eyes flicking between Linda and Jamal before quickly returning to his screen. Further back, a middle-aged woman, adjusting the scarf around her neck, frowned slightly but said nothing. Jamal could feel the weight of unspoken thoughts in the air as he moved toward his seat. He had grown accustomed to the quiet pauses, the skeptical glances, the unspoken assessments people made when they saw him in places they didn't expect. He had learned long ago not to react, to let his presence speak louder than their doubts. But even as he slid into his seat and placed his backpack neatly at his feet, he could still feel Linda's eyes lingering on him for just a second longer before she turned back to greet the next passenger, her cheerful tone returning as if nothing had happened. Linda hesitated just a moment longer than necessary before finally stepping aside, but as Jamal passed, she tilted her head slightly and let out a small, incredulous laugh. "You're in the right section? First class?" The way she said it wasn't outright hostile, but it carried a tone that wasn't meant to be mistaken for casual conversation. It was the kind of question that wasn't actually a question at all. It was an accusation wrapped in feigned politeness. Jamal didn't react, didn't pause, didn't ask for clarification. He had heard that tone before, had been asked versions of that same question in different places by different people, always laced with the same disbelief. He simply nodded, his face unreadable. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was even, measured, and without an ounce of emotion, because that was how you survived moments like this. Linda stared for another second as if expecting him to crack, to fumble, to admit he had made a mistake. When he didn't, she exhaled sharply through her nose and finally stepped aside, allowing him to pass. But as he moved toward his seat, her lips curled into a smirk, and as another flight attendant walked up beside her, she let out a small, dismissive chuckle. "I swear, they let anyone in here these days." The other flight attendant, a younger blonde woman named Rachel, blinked in mild surprise at the comment but said nothing. Instead, she simply moved past Linda and continued assisting another passenger. A businessman, 2 rows ahead, flipping through a leather portfolio, briefly looked up at the exchange. His jaw tightened, but after a second he lowered his eyes back to his papers. He had caught it, the same way anyone who was paying attention would have caught it, but like so many others, he decided it wasn't his place to say anything. Jamal, already a few feet ahead, didn't turn back, didn't give any indication that he had heard her. He just kept moving, weaving through the plush seats of first class with a kind of effortless composure that made it impossible to tell whether he was ignoring the remark or simply too used to comments like that to acknowledge them. The cabin itself seemed indifferent to the interaction. The hum of conversation continued, glasses clinked lightly against polished tray tables as passengers adjusted themselves for takeoff, and the soft voice of the captain filtered through the speakers with routine pre-flight announcements. Everything moved forward as if nothing had happened. Jamal reached his seat, 3A, near the window. He took a moment to set his backpack down carefully, unzipping the front pocket to retrieve his headphones before sliding into the leather chair. The material was smooth, cool against his skin, the kind of comfort only available in spaces designed for those who were used to a certain standard of living. As he leaned back, he exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders once as if shaking off the weight of the interaction. He wouldn't let it bother him, not today. But even as he focused on adjusting his seat, pulling out the in-flight entertainment remote, he could still feel it. That unspoken tension that had lingered just long enough to make it clear that, in Linda's mind, he didn't belong here. Linda made her way down the aisle with the kind of confidence that came from years of experience, her polished heels clicking softly against the carpeted floor. She stopped beside Jamal's seat, her smile stretched a little too wide, her voice deliberately louder than necessary. "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" The question cut through the soft murmur of the cabin like a blade. Heads turned, subtle at first, but within seconds, nearly every nearby passenger was glancing up from their drinks, their newspapers, their tablets. Some looked merely curious, others uncomfortable, as if sensing the sharp shift in the atmosphere but unsure whether to acknowledge it. Jamal, who had just placed his headphones around his neck, turned his head slowly to meet Linda's gaze. His expression didn't change, didn't flinch, but his fingers curled slightly against the armrest. He could already feel what was coming. He kept his voice steady, controlled. "Yes, ma'am." Linda tilted her head as if considering his answer, then extended a manicured hand. "Let me see your ticket again." Jamal blinked, not because he was surprised, but because there was no real reason for her to ask. He had already scanned it at boarding, already been seated for nearly 10 minutes without issue. He knew that, she knew that, and yet, here she was, pressing the issue as if she were daring him to refuse. Without a word, he reached into his hoodie pocket, pulled out the neatly folded ticket, and handed it over. Linda took it, but rather than simply glancing at it, she held it up to the light, turning it slightly as if inspecting it for forgeries. She squinted, her lips pressing together, and for a moment the silence around them grew heavier. Jamal could feel the weight of the cabin's collective attention pressing down on him. A businessman across the aisle glanced at his seatmate, his brow furrowing. A middle-aged woman adjusting her watch let out a quiet breath. Linda gave a small, humorless chuckle, shaking her head as she finally handed the ticket back. "Haha, must be nice to have connections." Jamal inhaled slowly through his nose. The remark wasn't direct, but the meaning was crystal clear. Across the aisle, Mrs. Bennett, the elderly woman who had been silently observing since boarding, pursed her lips, fingers tightening slightly around the spine of the hardcover book resting in her lap. She had seen this sort of thing before. She had heard those words spoken in that same tone, that deliberate, dripping condescension disguised as casual conversation. Jamal took the ticket without looking at Linda, unfolding it and tucking it back into his hoodie pocket. His heartbeat had quickened slightly, but outwardly he was the picture of restraint. Linda lingered for a second longer than necessary, her expression unreadable, before finally stepping back. "Well, let me know if you need anything," she said, the false sweetness in her voice barely masking the thinly veiled irritation beneath. Then, as if dismissing him entirely, she turned on her heel and moved to the next row, her cheerful tone returning as she addressed the next passenger as if nothing had happened. The murmurs began again, quieter this time, but no less present. Jamal let out a slow breath, flexing his fingers once before resting them on his lap. Mrs. Bennett watched him for a moment, then, with a decisive nod, reached across the aisle, tapping his arm lightly. When he turned to her, she offered him a kind but knowing look. "Don't let her get to you, dear." Jamal gave her a small, appreciative nod. "I won't," he said, his voice steady. But even as he settled back into his seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time Linda found an excuse to single him out. The soft chime of the intercom signaled the final preparations for takeoff, and the cabin was filled with the rustling of passengers adjusting their seats, folding up tray tables, and settling in for the flight ahead. Jamal had already secured his seatbelt, his hands resting loosely on his lap, his gaze fixed out the window, as the runway lights blurred into streaks against the deepening twilight. The momentary stillness was a welcome relief, a pause from the tension that had already begun to settle around him like an invisible weight. But then, just as he exhaled, a voice cut through the calm, sharp and unmistakable. "Sir, your seatbelt," Linda barked from the aisle. Jamal turned his head, his brows pulling together slightly. His seatbelt was fastened. Had been since the announcement first came on. He didn't move, didn't react beyond the slight narrowing of his eyes as he met her gaze. Linda was already reaching for him, her hand gripping the strap of his seatbelt as if preparing to help him with something that didn't need fixing. "Let me make sure it's secure," she added, her voice edged with artificial patience, the same tone a teacher might use when explaining something to a particularly slow student. Jamal tensed instinctively at the unnecessary contact, his muscles going rigid beneath her touch. It wasn't forceful, wasn't outright aggressive, but it was deliberate. A display, a moment of control, of ownership over the space and the people within it. His voice came out low, measured. "It's already fastened." Linda hesitated for only a fraction of a second before she gave the strap a quick, exaggerated tug as if checking for herself. Satisfied, or maybe just unwilling to admit she had been wrong, she released it with a small huff, straightening up. "Just making sure," she said, her lips curving into a tight smile. Jamal's jaw flexed, but he stayed still, his hands curling slightly into the fabric of his jeans before he slowly relaxed them again. A beat of silence followed. Then, from across the aisle, a voice, soft yet laced with steel, broke through. "Young man," Mrs. Bennett said, leaning slightly toward him, her eyes sharp, unwavering, "don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." The words landed heavier than they should have. weighted with something deeper, something unspoken, but understood between them. Jamal turned to her, and for the first time since stepping onto the plane, he allowed a flicker of something other than restraint to show, a quiet kind of gratitude, an acknowledgement that he wasn't the only one who saw what was happening. Linda's expression barely shifted, but something in her posture stiffened. She scoffed under her breath, rolling her eyes as if dismissing the entire exchange before pivoting away, her attention snapping to another passenger as if she had far more important things to deal with. As she walked off, Mrs. Bennett's gaze lingered on Jamal, studying him the way only someone who had lived long enough to recognize history repeating itself could. She didn't say anything else, just gave him a small, firm nod before returning to her book. Jamal turned back toward the window, the runway lights now glowing against the darkening sky. He inhaled deeply, slow and steady, willing himself to let the moment pass. But he knew, just as surely as Mrs. Bennett did, that this wouldn't be the last time tonight that Linda tried to remind him of the invisible lines she believed he had crossed. The soft clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversation filled the first-class cabin as dinner service began. The rich aroma of seared steak, buttered risotto, and fresh salmon drifted through the air, mingling with the scent of warm bread and expensive wine. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, placing down plates with practiced efficiency, their voices smooth and polished as they offered meal choices. "Would you prefer the filet mignon or the pan-seared salmon tonight, sir?" "Can I top off your wine, ma'am?" The passengers responded with polite nods, murmured thanks, and the occasional amused chuckle at a well-placed joke from the crew. Jamal waited patiently, hands folded in his lap, as he watched Linda work her way down the aisle. He had already selected his meal. Vegetarian pasta, a standard option he had confirmed when he booked his ticket. Yet, as Linda approached, he noticed a distinct pattern. She greeted the man in 2B with a warm smile, pouring him a fresh glass of wine before setting down his plate. She lingered at 2C, exchanging a few friendly words with a well-dressed woman who had requested an extra side of vegetables. She moved on to the next row, continuing the same rhythm, placing down meals, refilling drinks, chatting just enough to maintain the polished warmth expected in first class. And then she reached Jamal's row. Without a glance, without a word, she passed him by completely. Jamal blinked, glancing down at his tray table, which remained empty. He turned slightly, expecting that perhaps she had missed him by accident. Maybe she had meant to come back, had simply gotten distracted. But no. She was already at the next row, handing out plates with the same cheerful efficiency as before. A strange tightness settled in his chest. He exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. He had a choice: let it slide, pretend it was nothing, or speak up. He wasn't in the mood for a confrontation, but he also wasn't about to sit there and go hungry because Linda had decided to make a point. He raised his hand slightly, just enough to get her attention. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but firm. Linda paused, turning her head slowly, her expression unreadable. Jamal kept his voice even. "I didn't get my meal." For a brief second there was silence. Then Linda let out a small, breathy laugh and rolled her eyes as if he were an inconvenience rather than a paying passenger. "Oh," she said, drawing out the word, making a show of glancing down at her cart. "Guess I must have skipped over you." She didn't bother to ask what he had ordered. Instead, she reached down, grabbed a plate from the cart, and slammed it down in front of him. The force wasn't enough to spill anything, but it was just hard enough to make a point. "Enjoy," she said flatly before turning on her heel. Jamal inhaled sharply, staring down at the plate in front of him. He lifted the lid, and immediately the scent of rich, marbled steak filled his nose. His stomach twisted. He didn't eat meat. He had made that clear when he booked the flight. He had reminded the airline at check-in, and yet, here it was, a perfectly plated steak dinner sitting in front of him as if this were some sort of joke. He exhaled slowly, counting to 3 in his head before looking back up. "Excuse me?" he said again. Linda stopped mid-step. She turned just enough to glance over her shoulder, her expression tight. "What now?" Jamal didn't react to her tone. He kept his hands flat on his lap, his voice steady. "I ordered the vegetarian meal." Linda blinked, as if processing his words, before letting out a small, almost amused scoff. She crossed her arms, shifting her weight onto one foot. "Oh," she said, tilting her head. "I don't recall you mentioning that. You should really speak up next time." A beat of silence passed. Several passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. A man 2 rows ahead frowned slightly, his grip tightening around his fork. A younger woman beside him shifted in her seat, her lips pressing into a thin line. Even the businessman, who had remained silent earlier, briefly looked up from his laptop, his expression unreadable. Across the aisle, Mrs. Bennet set her wineglass down with deliberate precision. "That's enough," she said, her voice cutting through the cabin like a knife. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of the flight finally broke. Linda stiffened, her smile vanished. Passengers turned, eyes flicking between the 2 women. Mrs. Bennet's gaze was steady, unwavering, her expression a perfect mask of polite disapproval. "I think you've made your point, dear," she continued, her voice measured but sharp. "Now go fetch the young man's meal." Linda's jaw tightened, her fingers curling slightly at her sides. For a moment she looked like she might argue, might try to defend herself, but then she saw Elisa Phelan's words, the way the passengers were watching, the way some were already murmuring to one another, the way a businessman near the front had actually pulled out his phone as if considering whether this was a moment worth recording. Her nostrils flared. She turned, grabbed a vegetarian meal from the cart with more force than necessary, and practically shoved it onto Jamal's tray. "Here," she muttered, before storming off, her shoulders rigid, her face a mask of frustration. Jamal didn't say anything, didn't move. His hands, resting on the tray table, had begun to shake just slightly. He flexed his fingers once, then twice, before taking a slow, deep breath. Mrs. Bennet, watching him carefully, gave him a small nod, the kind of nod that said, "I saw that. We all saw that." Jamal nodded back, but as he picked up his fork, the meal in front of him suddenly didn't seem all that appetizing anymore. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The quiet murmurs that had once been polite background noise had taken on a different tone. Low whispers, hushed conversations exchanged behind cupped hands, subtle glances flicking toward the front of the plane where first class blended into the private suites. It wasn't the usual small talk about stock markets or real estate. There was a ripple of anticipation, the kind that only happened when something or someone was worth noticing. Linda, still seething from the confrontation with Mrs. Bennet, moved briskly toward the galley, her hands tightening around the edges of the food cart. She needed a distraction, something to refocus her energy before her irritation got the better of her. As she turned the corner near the service station, she caught the tail end of a conversation between 2 sharply dressed executives seated near the front, their voices just low enough to indicate they weren't trying to be overheard, but not quite low enough to stop her from listening. "I can't believe he's on this flight," one of them murmured, shaking his head slightly. "I've been in business for years, and I don't think I've ever seen him fly commercial. Must be keeping things low-key." The other man, younger, with a neatly pressed suit and an expensive watch that gleamed under the cabin lights, leaned in slightly. "You're talking about David Carter, right?" Linda froze mid-step. "Of course I'm talking about Carter," the first man said, his voice carrying the kind of reverence reserved for people who didn't just have money, but power. One of the most influential men in the country. Tech, finance, philanthropy. He's got his hands in everything. The guy's practically a ghost. Never travels without security, barely ever seen in public unless it's a major event. The younger executive let out a quiet whistle. "And he's on this flight. Damn, you'd think he'd be in a private jet." "Probably usually is," the first man agreed. "But apparently his son is flying in first class. Kept it discreet. Didn't want too much attention, I guess." Linda felt the words slam into her like a punch to the gut. Her fingers, still gripping the cart, dug into the metal edge. Her stomach twisted. Her mind raced, piecing things together at a dizzying speed. Carter. Son. First class. "Jamal!" A slow, creeping sensation crawled up the back of her neck, cold and suffocating. She had spent the last hour dismissing, humiliating, and singling out a kid who wasn't just some random teenager out of place in first class. He was the son of David Carter, a man whose name alone could make CEOs sweat, a man who had the power to ruin everything for her with a single phone call. Linda's breath hitched. She swallowed hard, straightened her posture, and forced her face into a neutral mask. But no matter how much she tried to control it, a sharp, gnawing panic had already settled in her chest. The murmurs in first class hushed almost instantly when a deep, authoritative voice carried through the cabin, cutting through the low hum of conversation like a blade. "Here you are, kid. How's the flight?" Every head turned. A ripple of silence spread through the space, tension coiling in the air as if the very atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't just the voice. It was the weight behind it. The unmistakable presence of someone important. Someone who didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. Jamal looked up, his posture still composed, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes, a subtle shift in the set of his shoulders. He had been expecting this moment, maybe even waiting for it. Stepping into first class from the private suites was a man whose presence alone altered the room's energy. David Carter, 6'2", impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, the kind of understated elegance that didn't scream wealth, but whispered power. His salt and pepper beard was trimmed to perfection, his sharp brown eyes scanning the space with quiet calculation. He wasn't just rich, he was one of the richest, a name that carried weight in industries spanning from tech to finance, a man whose philanthropy and influence had put him on the cover of Forbes more times than anyone could count. And now here he was, standing in the aisle of a commercial flight, completely at ease, yet exuding the kind of authority that made people sit up straighter without realizing why. He moved toward Jamal with an effortless confidence, not rushed, not hurried, just completely in control. When he reached his son, he placed a firm hand on Jamal's shoulder, a simple yet unmistakably protective gesture. "Did they treat you well?" His voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, something measured, something that expected an answer. Jamal hesitated for half a second. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was enough. David's gaze flicked up, scanning the cabin like a man assessing a battlefield. His eyes moved over the passengers, the expensive suits, the polished expressions, the way some people were still pretending not to watch while others were staring outright. Then his attention landed on Linda. The moment their eyes met, her entire body locked up. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She tried, she really did, but it was like her brain had short-circuited, the sheer realization crashing into her like a tidal wave. Jamal Carter wasn't just some random teenager in first class. He was David Carter's son, and she had just spent the entire flight humiliating him. The blood drained from her face so fast she felt lightheaded. Her breath caught in her throat, her hands clenched tightly at her sides to stop them from shaking. Passengers were watching, waiting. Some were already whispering again, exchanging knowing glances. The businessman who had frowned earlier was now looking at Linda with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and disappointment. Mrs. Bennet had set her book down entirely. Her sharp gaze locked onto Linda, as if daring her to speak. Linda's instinct screamed at her to fix this, to backtrack, to recover. She forced a smile, though it felt paper-thin, her voice barely managing to sound even. "Oh, Miss Carter, what an honor to have you on board. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to let us know." David didn't react immediately. He just looked at her, and somehow, that was worse than anything he could have said. Linda felt like she was being studied, every inch of her laid bare under his gaze, as if he had already figured her out in seconds. Jamal, still sitting, didn't say anything either. He didn't have to. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, and Linda felt every second of it. Then, finally, David gave a slow nod, his grip on Jamal's shoulder tightening, just slightly, before he turned his attention back to his son. "Let's talk," he said simply. And just like that, he took the seat beside Jamal, completely ignoring Linda. The dismissal was crushing. Passengers were definitely noticed now. A few exchanged looks, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others watching with thinly veiled satisfaction. Linda, still standing, felt paralyzed, her mind racing for a way to fix this, to undo what had already been done. But deep down, she knew there was nothing she could do, nothing she could say, because David Carter wasn't the type of man you insulted and got away with it. Linda felt the weight of every eye in the cabin pressing down on her, the silent judgment suffocating. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she forced herself into action, plastering on the kind of smile she had perfected over years of customer service. Bright, polished, but trembling at the edges. She had to fix this. She rushed forward, smoothing her uniform with clammy hands, her voice adopting a forced sweetness that barely masked the desperation bubbling underneath. "Mr. Carter, what an honor to have you on board today. If there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable, anything at all." David Carter turned his head toward her, slowly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes? His eyes were something else entirely. Cold, piercing, unforgiving. "She's done enough." 3 words. Calm, even, final. Linda felt her stomach drop so hard she thought she might actually be sick. A sharp inhale sounded from somewhere behind her. Someone shifted in their seat. The businessman 2 rows ahead raised an eyebrow, a small, knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Mrs. Bennet, still holding her glass of wine, let out a soft huff of amusement, watching Linda unravel like she had seen this story play out before. Linda opened her mouth, then closed it. Her throat was dry, her entire body locking up under the weight of Carter's gaze. There was nothing to say, nothing she could do to undo what had already been done. David had already dismissed her. But worse than that, the entire cabin had dismissed her. Passengers who had previously kept their heads down, too polite or indifferent to get involved, were now watching her fall apart. Linda felt it. The shift in the social dynamic, the realization settling in her bones that she had lost control of this flight. She forced another tight, breathless laugh, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "Of course, sir. Absolutely. If you need anything, just let me know," she said, voice cracking slightly. David didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he turned his attention back to Jamal, speaking to him in a low voice, as if Linda no longer existed. That was the worst part. Not anger, not yelling, indifference. Linda took a step back, her hands shaking slightly as she turned. Too quickly, nearly bumping into the food cart as she scrambled away from the row. The humiliation burned, hot and searing, her skin prickling as she tried to regain her composure. But she could feel them. The passengers, the judgment. Mrs. Bennet taking a slow sip of wine, like she had just won a bet. Linda's face burned. She wanted to disappear. Jamal had been silent for most of the flight, letting the moments pass, letting the weight of Linda's behavior settle in the space between them. But now, with his father seated beside him, with the entire cabin watching, with the power dynamic completely shifted, he felt this was his moment. He lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Linda, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying the sharp edge of a truth that cut deeper than any outburst ever could. "From the moment I stepped on this plane, you made it clear what you thought of me." He let the words hang, giving them the space to sink in, to land exactly the way they were meant to. Lyndon's breath hitched. Jamal didn't blink, didn't hesitate. "But now," he continued, his voice quieter, yet somehow louder than anything else in the room, "I see you clearly too." A murmur rippled through the cabin, a subtle shift in energy. Passengers nodded. Some exchanged knowing glances. Others simply sat in the thick silence, letting it unfold. A businessman in the front row, who had been watching everything with sharp eyes, subtly lifted his phone, snapping a discreet photo. Another passenger beside him did the same, fingers moving swiftly over the screen, as if texting someone the details of what they had just witnessed. Linda felt the shift immediately, the unraveling, the walls closing in around her. Her entire body tensed, and she took an instinctive step back, as if distance could somehow erase what had just happened. But it was too late. Her world, the one she had carefully controlled, the one where she had authority, was crumbling right in front of her. She opened her mouth. Whether to explain, to defend herself, to deny what had happened, she didn't know. But no words came out, because there was nothing left to say. David Carter, without even looking at her, reached over and gave his son's shoulder a firm, reassuring squeeze. Not as a show of power, not as a display for the cabin, just a father acknowledging his son's strength. Jamal didn't need to prove himself. Linda was the one who had been exposed. Passengers continued watching, some with quiet approval, some with growing amusement, and some with outright satisfaction. The story had already left this plane. It was on its way to being shared, retold, and remembered. Linda took another step back, her legs feeling weak, her heart pounding. She had lost. The plane had landed, and the familiar chime signaled the end of the flight. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts, stretching, gathering their belongings, ready to step back into their lives. But the weight of what had just transpired still hung thick in the air. Conversations were hushed, glances were exchanged, but no one dared to speak openly. Jamal stood up, moving with the same quiet confidence he had carried throughout the flight. His father rose beside him, adjusting his suit jacket with effortless grace. There was no rush in their movements, no urgency. They carried themselves the way men who knew their worth always did. Unshaken, unbothered, undeniable. Linda didn't move. She stood near the galley, fingers curled so tightly around the edge of a serving cart that her knuckles had turned white. Her face, normally composed, was stiff with the strain of holding herself together. She had been prepared for an apology to smooth things over, for some way to salvage her standing. But none came. Jamal and David Carter didn't spare her another glance. It wasn't anger, it wasn't contempt, it was indifference. And that was worse than anything else. As Jamal adjusted his backpack and stepped into the aisle, a quiet but deliberate movement caught his eye. Across from him, Mrs. Bennett lifted her glass of wine, her gaze steady, and with the smallest tilt of her wrist, she toasted him. Jamal met her eyes, a slow, knowing smile pulling at the corner of his lips. He gave her a small nod in return, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Linda saw it too. She felt it. The way the entire cabin had shifted around her. The way respect had changed hands. Jamal and his father stepped off the plane, heads high, walking into the terminal where the rest of the world was waiting for them. And Linda? She stayed behind, standing frozen, drowning in the silence of everything she had lost. The last of the passengers filtered out of the plane, their voices fading as they stepped into the bright, bustling terminal. The once luxurious first-class cabin, filled with quiet conversations and hushed judgment, was now empty. Trays had been cleared, seats smoothed, blankets neatly folded. Everything appeared as it should be, but the atmosphere was different. The walls felt tighter, the silence heavier. Linda stood near the galley, staring blankly at the vacant rows of leather seats, her heartbeat a dull, uneven thud against her ribs. The echo of the flight's final moments replayed in her mind, looping over and over like a scene she couldn't escape. The whispers hadn't stopped, even as passengers left. Some had walked past her with nothing more than a lingering glance, a shake of the head, a knowing smirk that said everything without a word. A few attendants passed by, exchanging looks before quickly turning their attention elsewhere. No one comforted her, no one reassured her, no one told her it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Because it was. Her hands trembled as she reached for a glass, needing something to hold, something to anchor herself, but the moment her fingers wrapped around the cool surface, she saw them. Her own reflection, faint and distorted in the polished metal of the galley counter. For the first time, she really looked at herself. And what she saw wasn't the professional, seasoned flight attendant she had always imagined herself to be. It wasn't the respected crew member who knew how to control a cabin, how to manage passengers, how to maintain order. It was a woman who had been so sure of her own authority, so certain of her place, that she hadn't realized she had been completely, utterly wrong. A woman who had let her assumptions guide her, who had judged a boy before he even spoke, who had humiliated him over and over again, never once considering what it said about her, not until it was too late. Her chest tightened, shame creeping up her throat like something toxic. She had spent the flight believing she had control. She had ended it with nothing. The passengers had seen her, really seen her, and they would remember. Jamal Carter had walked off that plane with his head high, without needing to say another word. And Linda? She had to live with the weight of knowing that she had been the villain in someone else's story. Linda remained frozen in place, the weight of her own actions pressing down on her like an unbearable force. The once familiar hum of the plane felt foreign now, the polished surfaces around her suddenly cold and impersonal. She had walked onto this flight feeling in control, certain of her place, her authority, the unshakable confidence that she understood the rules of the world. But as she stood there, staring at the empty cabin, she realized something she had never truly considered before. What if she had been wrong all along? She had spent years perfecting the art of silent judgments, disguising bias under the veil of professionalism. She had prided herself on keeping order, on maintaining the invisible boundaries that dictated who belonged and who didn't. But those same boundaries had just crumbled beneath her feet, exposing a truth she couldn't ignore. Jamal Carter had walked off this plane with grace, strength, and dignity, while she stood here with nothing but the bitter aftertaste of her own humiliation. And now, long after the flight had ended, one question echoed in her mind. What would she do next? Because in the end, it wasn't just about what had happened on this plane. It was about what she would take from it. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she had an answer. Have you ever been judged unfairly? How did you handle it? Moments like these happen every day, in ways big and small. A job interview where assumptions are made before you even speak. A store clerk watching you a little too closely. A teacher who never quite gives you the same benefit of the doubt. It's easy to say you'd brush it off, that it wouldn't bother you, that you'd rise above it, but when it happens over and over again, when it becomes a pattern rather than an exception, it takes a toll. So what do? Do you call it out? Do you ignore it? Do you carry it with you? Or do you let your dignity speak louder than their doubts? If you were on this flight, would you have spoken up? Mrs. Bennett did. A few passengers exchanged glances. Some nodded in quiet agreement. But for most, the discomfort was there, and yet they said nothing. Would you have stayed silent, hoping someone else would say something? Would you have watched, unsure if it was your place to interfere? Or would you have made it clear that everyone deserves respect no matter where they sit? Do you think people like Linda truly change? That's the question, isn't it? Some might say no, that people like Linda don't change, that they go home, find excuses, tell themselves it wasn't that bad. But maybe, just maybe, when she lays in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she won't be able to shake the way Jamal looked at her, the way David Carter dismissed her, the way Mrs. Bennett smirked, as if she had seen this all before. Maybe she'll remember the whispers, the glances, the judgment turned back on her. Maybe next time she'll think twice. Maybe next time she'll choose better. Prejudice may go unnoticed, but dignity always speaks louder. The real question is, when you see injustice, will you remain silent or will you stand up? Comment and share if you believe everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are.